strategies is to move your InfoPath data to list forms. List forms then allow you to customize the forms with InfoPath or to use other technologies. And so today we'd like to focus on the list forms and show you a couple of cool techniques that we came up with to allow you to edit your repeating data, which is one of the challenges that many of you have. I would say 95% of all forms out there have repeating data. List forms don't support them out of the box, so we have a cool technique that will allow you to edit multiple repeating items in a list form. And for that, today I'd like to reintroduce Jennifer Lindsay, who's one of our top presenters here at Qdabra. Jennifer?
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. Today we will be talking about parent-child list forms, and this is a technique that we've demonstrated a couple of times over the past year or two using generic InfoPath forms, and either using our QRules plugin or using the Camel technique, where you can display non-repeating and repeating data on the same page and manage multiple lists simultaneously. Today we're going to look at an out-of-the-box technique, or collection of out-of-the-box techniques, that will let you do much of the same technique directly in an InfoPath list form. So this is good if you have multiple lists that feed off of one another. Maybe you have, in our particular example that we'll be going through, we have an expense report where the parent list contains the actual different expense reports and the metadata associated with that, and the child list contains the individual expenses associated with each report. So we'll show how you can use some out-of-the-box techniques to connect those two lists together and add new expenses and add new expense reports. And we'll also show you how you can make editing these forms a little bit more stylish and a little less clunky than the out-of-the-box InfoPath list form that you get when you create a brand new list.
Hey Jen, before we get started with the demos, let's do a quick poll and see how many people are using InfoPath to edit their SharePoint list forms. And it looks like we've got about 2/3 of you doing that. We'll just give it another 2 or 3 seconds here. We got 80% voted. About 70%, it looks like, 69% are using them. So that's great. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So this should be a very useful topic for most of you on the call today. All right, let's go ahead and launch into today's presentation. So if you've ever used a regular InfoPath list form, you'll know that you do have the ability to add multiple items simultaneously. But however, you do have to start out creating a multiple item list at the very beginning. So if you have an existing list that already has items in it, it's already in production, it's being in use, you can't just convert that over to a multiple item list without recreating the entire list and redoing whatever data connections you have or workflows you have attached to that. So that's really not a workable solution. If you're interested in using a generic InfoPath form instead of an InfoPath list form, there is an out-of-the-box technique called Camel that allows you to submit multiple items to any particular list on your site. However, it's actually it's a fairly complex technique. We have a couple of tutorials related to that out on our InfoPath Dev website if you're really interested in marching through that technique. It is useful, but it's rather complex to set up, and there are many places where it could go wrong, and you could have trouble troubleshooting it as well. Another thing that InfoPath does not let you do in list forms is update multiple items at once. You can add multiple items if you start out with a multiple item list, but you can't update multiple items. And sometimes it can be useful to update a whole bunch of items at once instead of clicking on the item in the list, opening it up, making your change, submitting. That can be extremely tedious if you have more than just a handful of items that you want to update. So today we're going to look at a solution to this dilemma that will allow you to add multiple items and update multiple items all within the same list form session. So you don't have to close, reopen that list form in order to do that. What this does is it uses a secondary data source back to the exact same list. So what you do is you pull in all of the list items that you want to edit into that secondary data source. Then what you have to do, and this is specific to list forms, you have to query the main data source in order to set the context. You don't necessarily have to pull anything back in that main data source, but you do have to query it because that's going to be key to what the form does if you try to update the items. So then what we do, we've pulled in all of the list items in this secondary data source. We copy all those fields over into the main data source, or we copy over the fields that we want to edit into the main data source, and then we submit those edits back to the list. And I'll show you this in action here in just a few minutes, and then we'll go through the actual list form in designer mode and take a look at how we're actually implementing these rules. And this is all possible within the same data grid form. So again, we're not closing and reopening the form, closing and reopening the form in order to do all of these individual edits. And this means that you can apply some really nice formatting to the list form and get some great UI design in there without too much extra hassle. So let's go ahead and see this in action now. I'll switch over to my SharePoint site. And here I have a list of expenses. This is my child list. What I've done in order to connect this list to the parent list, which is the expense report list, is I've set up a lookup column here. And all this does is ensure that the values that appear in this report lookup column are tied to the values that appear in this expense report column. So here is the parent list, the expense report list. You'll see the titles here are the actual names of the expense reports. We've got a couple of tests in there we were running through this morning. And then these values are accessed by the lookup column in the child list, the expense list, and so that ensures that the expenses that you're able to submit can only be submitted for existing reports. Oops, looks like I accidentally clicked on this. Give me a second here, and hopefully this will cancel itself out. Okay, let me go ahead and close that. All right, so supposing if I wanted to add a new item or edit this list, what we've done is edit the basic list form so you can both add new items and edit the items by opening up the New Item button. And you may have noticed we are demoing on SharePoint 2013. This technique also works for SharePoint 2010 as well. So here you will see this is the list form associated with a child list. It looks very different from your standard out-of-the-box list form. We've done a lot of customization behind it. What this allows you to do is select any one of the reports that currently have expenses. So suppose I'm going to select Labor Day party planning, and here is the secondary data connection. This is actually not the main data source. This is that secondary data connection that we queried to pull in all of the existing expenses associated with this particular expense report. So now, if I wanted to add a new item to this, I would simply click the New Item button down here. This brings me up a blank row, and I can add, let's add some beer for the guests. So I've now added a new item to this list. And what this has done is copy over all of the information that I typed in here into the main data source, submitted it behind the scenes when I tabbed out of all of the fields. Once all of the fields are populated in this row, it submits it back to the main data source. It's now in the list. If I want to edit any of these lists, let's say for under stimulants, quote unquote, decided I don't really like Monster drinks, we're going to give them Red Bull. So I've now edited this field in the secondary data source. Once I tab out of this field, it's going to copy this into the main data source, because with a list form you can only submit things from the main data source. It's going to copy this row back into the main data source, and it's going to submit it using the built-in submit connection in the list form directly back to the list. And that built-in submit connection knows that since this already has an ID, it knows to use the update web service to update that existing list item instead of adding a new item. So I'm going to go ahead and tab out of here, and you saw that quick sending information to server dialog box pop up really quickly there, and that has actually submitted everything back. So now if I go ahead and close this list form, we should see this additional beer item down here, and we should also see the Red Bull edit to the existing stimulants item. So I'm going to go ahead and close this list form if it wants to close. There we go. And here we go. You can see here is the stimulants. We probably should have picked a better name for that. This particular list item here, it actually has made that update to change Monster to Red Bull. And down here at the bottom, you'll see that it also added that new item, the new beer item, some nice microbrews for the guests at this particular party. So let's go ahead and crack open the list form and take a look under the hood and see exactly how we got all of this magic to happen. Well, give me 1 second. My computer has decided to open the list form in designer mode on my other monitor. That always seems to happen when I'm presenting. Okay, so here is that list form for the child list that we just saw. I'm going to open the Manage Rules over here. So what we have going on here, and if in case you weren't aware, this is the stock fields display pane that you get when you open up a list form. You can actually switch down here by clicking Show Advanced View. You can switch to the Advanced View, and that allows you to access any secondary data connections that you've added to the form, just like you're used to doing in a regular InfoPath library associated form. Okay, so what's going on here is we have this report field, and this is what I used to select the expense report that I wanted to add items to. And all this does is this is simply a drop down that displays all of the reports. Remember, I had that lookup column in the list, and so that lookup column is, you can see here it says data type lookup type. That's how you know it's a lookup column without switching back to your list. So this is pulling in all of the existing reports that are in the parent list, the expense report list. And whenever I select a value, once I've selected the report I want to edit, it is querying the existing expenses list for every expense associated with that report. So we're actually querying the same list that we want to edit. Now, why are we doing that? We're doing that so that we can display a repeating table of all of the existing expenses. Now, remember, we have set this, so even though we're able to display and edit multiple items, this is only a single item list. So we did not check that add multiple or edit multiple items checkbox when we created this list. This is just a regular old list where the default list form would only allow you to modify and add single items. So in order to display everything, we created this secondary data connection back to the same list. We query it when someone selects a report, and then this repeating table here is the repeating table from the secondary data connection. So that's how I was able to display all of the existing expenses associated with the report that I had selected from the drop-down. Okay, that's great, but in order to edit and add new items, we need to modify that main data source. So when I edited that particular item, changed Monster to Red Bull in the description, what we have here are the same set of rules on all of the editable fields. So the expense field, the description field, the cost field. In practice, you probably wouldn't want to display the ID field. That's just there so that we could see the IDs of the list items we were editing. It's good to include that if you're debugging and doing this for the first time. That way you can go to the list, check the ID number of the list item, make sure that it's actually displaying all of the correct list items in the form when you're testing your secondary data connection. But in practice, you don't really need it. What you do need to display are any of the fields that you want the user to be able to edit. So those, in this case, that would be the name of the expense, the description, and the cost field. And on all of these, the rules are the same. So if someone edits this field and then tabs out of the field or changes focus by clicking somewhere else on the form, these 4 rules are going to run. So what we're doing here, we have set field value ID equals ID. So what's that doing? What that is doing is setting the ID field in the main data source to be the ID number of the row in the secondary data source that we've just edited. So this is the first step of copying everything over. So what you want to do is set that ID there. The next thing we're going to do is query the main data source. This may look really strange for you. You're used to probably querying secondary data sources to pull in information. Well, what we're doing here, and the reason why we need to query the main data connection here, is because we need to set focus for this particular form. We need to essentially change the focus of this list form to the particular list item that we want to be able to edit. So that's why what we're doing, we set the ID field for the main data connection, we query, and that tells the form we're getting ready to edit this particular list item. So we're setting the focus by querying the main data connection for that the ID for the row that we just edited. And the next thing we do is copy over all of the values from the secondary data source that we just edited, copy over all those values into the main data source. So in this case, we're copying over the expense, the description, and the cost. You can ignore title. That was a field that we were originally going to use when we started creating this demo and decided not to use it. So you want to make sure you copy over all of the fields that need to go into that particular list item. So here I am, I'm setting expense in the main data source equal to the expense in this row that I just edited in the secondary data source. Same thing for description, I'm copying that over to the main data source, and cost, I'm also copying that over to the main data source. Okay, so far we have set focus for the particular list form on the item we wanted to edit, and we've copied over all of our edits into the main data source. The last thing we do is submit the data that is now in our main data source back into the list. And that is how we do the updates. Now you may say, okay, you're really only updating one list item at a time. Well, yes, but we don't have to close and reopen the form if we wanted to edit something else. So if I wanted to edit multiple items, let me just pop open this form again here in the list. If I wanted to edit multiple items from this particular report, well, all I do is make my edit, tab out, and the form is still here. I can go over here and edit this now. I can edit any of these that I want. So the effective result for the end user is they appear to be editing all of these simultaneously, when what the form is really doing is copying everything over into the main data source and submitting it each time they edit a new list item. Okay, so that is the updating technique. Now if I'm adding a new item, this is actually much simpler because the list form itself already has that new item in it. Remember, what we've done is customize and reuse the existing list form. So there's always, the main data source is always sitting there. So if we're adding a new item, this is always here. All we have to do is fill in these fields. So when we click the new item button, all it's doing is adding a new row to that repeating table and setting some default values there. We're setting the ID to blank because it's a new list item. There's no ID associated until it gets submitted to the list. So we're setting ID equal to blank, and once all of those values are added, we're simply submitting to the main data connection. And then, oh, sorry, I said that wrong. What we're doing is we are submitting this blank list item to the list. So we're submitting a blank item to the list, which may seem strange, but then the very next thing we do is query that secondary data connection that is populating this repeating table, and that will pull in that blank item that we just submitted. So we've submitted a blank item, we've pulled it back into the secondary data connection, it's displayed as a blank line, and then as we fill in the fields in that new blank line, the steps that I just went through execute all over again, and the values that we type in get updated in that new blank item. So what we're really doing when we add a new item here is we're adding a blank item, then we're redisplaying that blank item and letting the user type in their edits, and then we update the blank item with the data that they've typed into those fields. All right, and that's the technique for allowing users to add and update multiple items in a single form session for a list form. Are there any questions right now before we launch into the rest of the presentation? I did quickly want to show the parent list, the expense report list, which has also been customized. So this is actually just a simpler version of what you saw with the child list, the expenses list. We can still make edits to this as well. And this runs through the exact same series of steps that I walked you through in the expense. So this is actually a secondary data source connecting back to the same expense reports list. That's how it's able to display multiple items all at the same time. And you make your edits by simply typing into the various text boxes and tabbing out, and that will submit the data back to the form. If I want to add a new item here, it looks like we had a bit of an error running behind this, but the new item again would work exactly the same way as it did in the expenses list. I would add a blank row down here, I type in my values and tab out, and then that would add it to the list behind the scenes. And you can see that where I changed that word to celebrating did get updated in this list. Okay, so looks like we might have a question. Oh, okay, Patrick, you're handling the questions. Wonderful, thank you very much.
Yeah, Jen. And we're kind of running out of time or two. Just a time check. If we could wrap up
Okay.
in a few minutes, that'd be great.
Sure, no problem. So the next thing that we wanted to look at is repeating data in list forms. One thing that we wanted to look at is a dashboard that would allow you to combine everything. So as you may notice there, the repeating that the essential parent list combination is that the expense reports would be single items, and then the effect of the expenses list is that everything is repeating, so you have multiple expenses per expense report. Out of the box list forms, if you wanted to get the repeating data, the adding multiple items, everything would have to repeating. You couldn't have one non-repeating row and a bunch of repeating rows in the same list form. So one thing you can do is embed the list forms that I just showed in a dashboard. So you'd have one on the top for the metadata associated with expense reports, one on the bottom for the repeating data, and you'd be able to see both at the same time. And you also have the ability using web part connectors to filter the data that goes back and forth between these two lists. Unfortunately, we are having some problems with our web part connectors this morning on our SharePoint site, but I will really quickly show you what that dashboard would look like. So here we have embedded at the top, we have the expense report, and then down here at the bottom we also have the expenses as well. So you're able to see both sides, both the parent and the child list on the exact same page. And how we did this is by using what's called a web part page. Let me quickly edit this page and show you. So what I've done is I've embedded an InfoPath form in two separate web parts in this page. And by doing that, I can display multiple forms all on the same page. Now, with the web part connectors working, which unfortunately it doesn't right now, you would be able to click this select button and have it automatically filter what appears down here, so you would see all of the expenses associated with that. Like I said, right now we're having some trouble getting that up and running, but the way you would do that is by using a built-in web service in the InfoPath list form that allows you to send data. It basically makes data from this form available outside of the form. And so this select button here, all this does is send data to WebPart, which is an available action in the list form. And that's all it is send data to WebPart. And what it will do is make all of the fields in the main data source here available to a web part on another page. And then what you would do is you'd go in and you'd edit this dashboard page. And over here in the edit menu, there is a connections option. There's an option to send data to, and it will display a list of all the other web parts on that page. I'm going to choose this one, and then you'll get a little pop-up that asks you what field you want to send from this form and what field you want to map it to. And so that way you can send data from the first form to the second form. And that would allow you to filter, if we could get it up and running, to filter the expenses. I'll cheat here. That would allow you to filter the expenses and display the expenses down here associated with the report that you selected up here.
Just one thing to point out to folks is that we could make it look a little bit more integrated by removing the header on the child and by removing the white space in between. But one of the limitations of having these two web parts is that you don't have an embedded kind of appearance. They're going to be separate. They're going to be one on top of the other, and there will be a little bit of a clunkiness when it refreshes. So you could create one single InfoPath form on top of both lists, but then you wouldn't be able to use the out-of-box techniques to update them. You'd have to use Camel or QRules to do it. And we've shown that in the past for those of you who want to have a more integrated look. You can't actually have the two lists in one InfoPath form, but that's a different topic than today. So we had a few questions, and I just want to thank Jen for this great presentation this morning. One of the questions, Jen, I think we'll just throw it on the floor here, which has a bit, I think it might stump us a bit, is how do you remove items? And I don't think we can, but do you have any ideas?
As far as removing items, yeah, the issue with that is what we're really doing is, in order to do the add and the update, we're really just using that update methodology more than once. Bulk deleting multiple items would be a challenge.
Is there a delete action though in InfoPath when you have a list form? I'm just wondering. Another idea that just came to mind is you could do a workflow underneath it. You could set some column to delete it, and then the workflow would delete it for you underneath the scenes, but that wouldn't be synchronous.
Right. No, it wouldn't update automatically. There is a delete item in the list web service. So if you could, I think, technically create a data connection to that particular web service and attempt to delete it that way. But I'm wondering if that might get a little messy there. And I think in order to use that web service, I think we'd be back into Camel territory as well.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for the questions this morning. And I guess, Jen, if you could throw up that last slide with the webinar survey. We do have these list forms we'll send you as samples. You will have to customize them because they won't work with your lists out of the box, but you can take a look at them in InfoPath Designer and see how we did it. Just fill out that survey. It's a really quick 3-question survey here that you'll see as the webinar concludes. And I want to thank you all for being here. We're going to do another webinar next week, and I look forward to